Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. So in this episode, we're traveling to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. These two Central Asian neighbors have been arguing about where to draw their shared border since the early 90s. And just recently, after months of negotiations, they announced a big breakthrough. They have agreed on the last disputed segments of their border. This is big news that you probably missed because you were too busy doom scrolling the social media. Now, before you get too excited and start screaming, "Yay for border agreements," to your bewildered pets, let's break this down because it is slightly more complicated than it seems. Anyway, here is our latest report.
This is what the people living on the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan had to witness just a couple of years ago. The 1,000-kilometer-long border between these two states is the last in Central Asia that is still disputed after the fall of the Soviet Union. After 33 years, the issue may finally be put to rest as an agreement defining the border has been reached.
Let me assuredly state that a historical moment of an agreement on the border happened today.
Both sides have had to persevere through hardships resulting from the border clashes.
Children, women and the elderly were evacuated to the village of Morgun because it was a very dangerous situation.
The situation has been very dangerous at times. Accusations of war crimes have been made against both sides.
After 2 hours of fighting, we came to see that the house was on fire. We put out the fire with the help of other villagers, but the house was burned down.
Many countries have shown interest in resolving this conflict, such as China, Russia and even the United States. The real work, some say, may still lie ahead as the border will actually have to be implemented and smaller disputes which may not be clear now will come to light.
In our shared commitment to sovereignty.
And now we're zooming in on the, until very recently, disputed border area in order to explain the issue in greater detail. So in the past years, there was a lot of confusion on the issue, and these border disputes have not been pretty. They have involved communities living in borderlands who often woke up in the morning not entirely sure which country they legally resided in. That's not a fun riddle. It's geopolitical confusion at its finest. On the 4th of December, representatives from both governments met in the Kyrgyz city of Batken and announced that they had reached what they call an agreement on the delimitation of their shared border. Now, delimitation is a fancy word for agreeing on the line on the map, while demarcation means actually going out there with markers, fences, to show everyone exactly where that line actually is. Think of delimitation like deciding on the guest list for a wedding, and demarcation like physically sitting everyone at the right tables before they start complaining about who's too close to Uncle Larry. The agreement itself, not many details yet. The announcements from both countries' official media were practically synchronized, stating that the whole thing took place in an atmosphere of friendship and mutual understanding. Right. Still, they did it, which is more than a lot of countries can say after decades of disputes. So, credit where credit is due. This is a diplomatic step forward. But hold on, before we pop the champagne, we need to understand that agreeing on paper is the easy part. The next phase, demarcation, is about to get infinitely more complicated. You see, it's one thing to say, we've drawn the border, sign here, stamp there, done. It's a whole other ordeal to physically plant the line on the ground and then explain to the residents, hey, guess what? Yesterday you were in Kyrgyzstan, but now technically you're in Tajikistan. Surprise! This is where domestic diplomacy comes in. When the representatives of both countries go home, they don't just have to get the parliaments and presidents to sign off. They need to make sure their own people buy into this deal. And historically, politicians on both sides have been really good at stirring up nationalist sentiment. Sort of like a chef who's mastered the add more salt principle, but never learned how to make a balanced dish. So now they must learn the subtle art of serving a dish of peaceful coexistence without undercooking the trust or over-seasoning with distrust. That border is roughly 975 kilometers long. That's a lot of fence posts, border crossings, and local interpretations of where one country ends and the other begins. So, the written agreement is just the first step on a very long journey. It's the final frontier in Central Asia. And for now, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are trying to boldly go where no Stan has gone before. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Bruce Pannier, board member at the Caspian Policy Center. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express. Good to see you again.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here.
So the border situation, this is good news, but to what extent, really? How sure can we be that in a couple of months we will have Emomali Rahmon and Sadir Japarov shaking hands and announcing the big news that the long-standing conflict is completely and utterly resolved?
Well, there's probably a pretty good chance that you'll see President Japarov and President Rahmon shaking hands and calling this a big success. As you note, there's still some questions here. They have delimitated the border. Now, how that's, we don't know many of the details about this, who got what property, but the local population has probably not been as involved in this process as they should have been. And so that's going to be the real question, is once people start putting up signposts or border posts, fences, how is that going to look on the ground? How are the people going to react to that when they actually see that now the border is here, whereas they thought for years that maybe it was a little further away from them on the other side?
So what you're saying is, essentially, delimitation is a piece of cake compared to the actual demarcation process, and this is where the most important differences may come to light.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely it. This is the border areas in the foothills of the Pamir Mountains. So you have mountain ridges that jut out and come back, and in between those are these valleys where it's mainly agriculture. So people are either growing crops or herding. Waterways go in and out on both sides of the border. Now, once you start to demarcate that and show people that you can no longer bring your herd past this marker here, or this part of what you thought was your farmland that you've been farming for years is now part of the other country and you're no longer allowed to use it. There's also questions of cemeteries that have been set up for years there too. What happens when the Tajik cemetery, or half of it, ends up on the Kyrgyz side of the border? What are going to be the visitation rights at that point? So, the real test is going to come once people start to understand the realities of what the demarcation is going to mean for them personally, especially, again, on lands, in some cases, that they've considered to be their families or their countries for decades now.
So let's go back to how this started, because on the one hand it is said that this is generally the result of the initial delimitation of the border being overly simplistic and not always taking into account local interests. But the border itself, it's not like one of these borders in Africa which simply look as if they were drawn as a straight line, which they often were. But when you look at Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, this border seems complex. On the map, it's almost like clasped hands, really. So to what extent would you say that these attempts were simply not made in good faith, i.e. simply done in order to have a border there somewhere? And to what extent is it just, the complexity of the region that made it so?
It's going to be very difficult. I mentioned, the waterways, for instance. There's canals and small rivers that run through, and like I said, they kind of zigzag back and forth. So it goes through Tajikistan into Kyrgyzstan, back into Tajikistan, back into Kyrgyzstan. And then again, there's the mountains too. So what are you going to do when the border is on these ridges there and hillsides that are going down? Are you actually going to mark that all the way along the hillside? So there's a number of factors here that are going to be very difficult for them to resolve in the future. And another one I would mention too is there are enclaves, exclaves, whichever you want to call them, that were put there when the Soviet map makers did this. And this is really the root of the problem there, is that the borders that they're using were drawn by Soviet map makers over the course of several decades. There was a map that they drew in the 20s. There was another one that they did in the 30s. There was another one they did in the 50s. So both sides were, of course, referring to the map that gave them the most land. But there are these enclaves that are on either side. I visited the Varuk enclave, which belongs to Tajikistan. It's got about 40,000 people living in it, rich agricultural area, surrounded totally by Kyrgyzstan. And to this day, you need to take a road through Kyrgyzstan to get to this Tajik enclave. So how's that going to work out? Are both sides going to abide by this, that the enclave absolutely belongs to Tajikistan? And you have to respect that Tajik people will be driving through Kyrgyzstan to get to this enclave and visit their relatives or do whatever they have to do without harassing them at checkpoints along the way, which has been a problem in the past, where Kyrgyz border guards or Kyrgyz civilians, residents, have vandalized or cars, vehicles that are passing through, or attacked people who were in the car, dragged them out and attacked them. And the same is true for what Tajiks have done to Kyrgyz when they've passed through Tajik territory. So the animosity has been building for a long time. And again, with all these different maps that they were using to try to figure out who owned what, and we're not sure about the details. I mean, who does end up owning what part? I mean, does somebody get more of the river than the other people thought they were supposed to have? What about water reservoirs in the area? How's that going to work? The reservoir might be in Tajikistan, but it's supposed to be understood that they release a certain amount of water that goes into Kyrgyzstan. What happens if it's drought and the Kyrgyz don't think they're getting enough? So there's endless complications. Obviously, it's good that they've gotten this far. You're showing photos right now of what's happened in 2021 and 2022 when the two militaries of the country actually had a small or very short wars. 3-day war in 2021, 6 days in 2022, artillery, mortars, rockets, attack helicopters, and in the 2022 campaign, even military drones were brought in. The animosity between the two communities has only gone up in the last 10 years since they actually started firing at each other. And of course, as I mentioned, in 2021 and 2022, it hit absolutely new heights where you had hundreds of people killed, huge damage to buildings, bridges, all kinds of things. So how easy is it going to be to put all that behind them now and understand that the new reality is here's the border and we don't want anyone to make any trouble about this, and you have to abide by what the governments in Bishkek and Dushanbe have agreed on.
And speaking of which, would you say that we can be 100% certain that this was simply the initiative of the two countries, or was there anyone acting behind the scenes to help them out, to get them to the table and say, look, you really need to get this agreement done because this damages not just your interests, but also ours?
I think that's been one of the most disappointing things about this whole process is there's several countries that could easily have gotten involved and have a reason to get involved. Russia being the first one, right? That the maps were all drawn in Moscow. Maps I referred to. Russia made kind of a half-hearted effort to say that they were willing to negotiate, but the Kyrgyz thought that was in bad faith. And Russia had a golden opportunity when the first conflict broke out in 2021. The secretaries of the security councils of the CSTO countries were meeting in Dushanbe. Now, both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. This would have been the time for the CSTO to step up and said, you're both member countries. We're going to step in as an organization, or Russia is going to step in, and we're going to establish some kind of truce along the border and help to guard that. But they didn't go that far. In fact, they didn't even hardly mention the fact that there was shooting going along the border as they were meeting not far away in Dushanbe. Uzbekistan would be a great candidate for someone who should have come up and said, we're willing to help you negotiate. Uzbekistan also shares the Fergana Valley with Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. It has also had border problems with Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which have been resolved lately, peacefully. Uzbekistan is a much bigger country. The Uzbek population is 37.5 million. Kyrgyzstan's population is about 8 million. Tajikistan's is 10, so Uzbekistan is almost twice as large in terms of population as either of those countries. It could easily have offered its goods services to try to help them negotiate, but they did not. China, both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China borders both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. The Chinese could have offered to mediate, hold meetings, border negotiation meetings in Beijing or somewhere in China, but they didn't do it. So in the end, you came away with the clear impression that no one wanted to get involved in this. Now, of course, at the end of the day, this has to be resolved between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. But it could have, both sides could have been prodded toward reaching some kind of agreement much earlier if any of the countries I named had wanted to step in and say, we're willing to hold negotiations in our country. We'll help you to resolve this as peacefully as possible and come to a solution that suits both parties.
So can we be sure that China did not discreetly try to expedite this process? Because with Russia, obviously, we've already seen that Russia's ability to get involved has become fairly limited. Following the onset of the war in Ukraine, Russia was not able to help out Armenia, even though Nikol Pashinyan was asking, help us out during the conflict with Azerbaijan. He received no help at all, hence his pivot towards the West. Now we also have Bashar al-Assad joining the list of disappointed friends of Moscow. But would you say the same thing about China? China has the resources, and China has been heavily involved in the economic activity there, being, as you've mentioned, the prime exporter, but also the construction companies being awarded contracts in that very region. So to what extent would it be possible to say that China might have played a role, it just chose not to advertise this openly?
China could have played, as you said, it might have been a very quiet role behind the scenes, although I don't think it amounted to any more than you guys should get together and resolve this problem. I think at the end of the day, no one wanted to be in the position where if the border deal went bad, and it still could go wrong, that the one party would blame them for having pushed them to make a deal that wasn't in their country's interest. So I think that was really the ultimate factor in deciding why people wanted to stay out of this. I should mention at this point that for what it's worth, the Turkish foreign minister was in both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan at the start of the year. And he said that they would have a border deal within a couple months. And we don't know, that was the limit of their mediation as far as we saw from reports. But they did at least go to both countries. The foreign minister went to both countries and tried to push them to come to a deal as fast as possible, and was very optimistic about the chances that they would reach a border deal in a very short time. They didn't meet his deadline, but in fact they did finish this by the end of the year. So I suppose Turkey might have also played some kind of role in that. Although again, this is one of those situations where it's hard to say, what party, would Tajikistan blame Turkey if Kyrgyzstan ended up getting a better end of the deal, because Turkey is a Turkish state, Turkic-speaking state, and Kyrgyzstan is a Turkic-speaking state, whereas Tajikistan is a Persian-speaking state, and so they would have grounds to come back to this 3 years down the line and say, we got a bad deal because the intermediary was always on the Kyrgyz side of this whole argument, which is what the Kyrgyz say about the Tajiks, or about Russia, excuse me, that they didn't want Russia to mediate because Russia was more interested in Tajikistan than it was in Kyrgyzstan. A huge Russian military base in Tajikistan, the Afghan borders there. Russia has interest in making sure there's stability along the Afghan border. So Kyrgyzstan thought that Russia would not be an objective arbitrator, in this dispute. And this just gives you an idea of the complications of trying to help them out. It would have been better if they'd had some help. But like I said, I think at the end of the day, no third party wanted to be left on the hook 2, 5, 10 years down the road as being the one that negotiated a bad border deal and was accused of having acted in bad faith.
Bruce Pannier explaining the intricacies of the dispute between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, a dispute which may have just taken an important step towards resolution. But what's going to happen next, well, only time can tell. Thank you very much for joining us here and sharing your insight.
Always great to be on your program. Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. And we're starting today's overview off with Ukraine. The United States says it is ready to train and equip Ukrainian soldiers if Kyiv changes its conscription policy. Washington has previously pushed for Ukraine to lower its conscription age from 25 to 18.
The US State Department spokesperson said if Ukraine produces more troops to fight in the war, then Washington and its allies will not only equip them for battle, but also train them. This statement comes as Ukraine has reportedly been struggling with manpower issues, in addition to various equipment shortages. The war has exacted a heavy toll on Ukraine's population, and mobilization efforts have perhaps not been as successful as some have hoped. The US in particular has been pushing for Kyiv to lower its mobilization age. For now, Kyiv has agreed to entice new recruits with better contracts and benefits. Lowering the mobilization age is seen as a potentially very unpopular move in Ukraine. Zelensky has refuted the pressure, pointing out that Ukraine's allies have so far only equipped 2.5 out of 10 Ukrainian brigades.
Staying on the subject of Ukraine and the military, President Volodymyr Zelensky has floated the idea of foreign troops being stationed in Ukraine until the country receives full NATO membership. This would be a way for him to secure his country as part of a peace deal with Russia.
Hi, good to see you.
At his conference with the German opposition leader, Zelensky said that Ukraine's security required not just NATO membership, but also European Union accession. Many European NATO members also happen to be part of the EU, especially on the eastern flank. He also said that a contingent of military forces from a NATO country could stay in Ukraine until it receives a full membership, to safeguard the country and dissuade Russia from further aggression. This proposal by the Ukrainian president echoes that of French President Emmanuel Macron, who had spoken of the possibility of deploying European forces to Ukraine. Kyiv has long sought a NATO membership, as it believes it to be the best security guarantee it can get. Its previous guarantees, namely the Budapest Memorandum, failed as one of its signatories, Russia, broke the agreement and invaded Ukraine in 2022.
Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko has issued 29 pardons for political prisoners. Hundreds of such prisoners still remain in the regime's grasp, however, and Minsk has been cracking down on dissent ahead of the upcoming presidential elections.
This footage from a couple of years ago claims to show a Belarusian political prisoner receiving medical treatment before his death. There are over 1,000 political prisoners currently being held by the Belarusian regime. They have been locked up on a plethora of different charges, many of them simply for refusing to bow down to the Belarusian president and the narratives he spins. More than half of those released in the latest wave reportedly have disabilities or chronic illnesses. Despite this latest set of pardons, Belarus is slipping even further into authoritarianism, observers warn. The Belarusian police has been cracking down even harder on dissent, as the 2025 presidential elections are right around the corner. It is clear that Lukashenko does not want a repeat of the 2020 election and intends to tighten his grip on power until there is nothing left to squeeze.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.